one of the good things about the situation is, when we were racing Newsblad, let's say, and everybody's there, season looked like it was normal. If somebody said, in a couple of months' time, Times Square is going to be empty, Fifth Avenue, New York's empty, Regent Street empty, I don't know, Rue de Rivoli empty, and Madrid empty, and the whole of the world's in lockdown. It's unimaginable. And yet here we are. And I think one of the great lessons out of this is sometimes we get stuck with not wanting to change, because it's like a inertia, and sometimes people just don't want change or don't think that change can happen. We should always open our minds to what can be and what forces change can bring, and forces for good, and things can improve,
Things can improve. And if there's ever a time to take a step back, reconsider, reevaluate, and then step forward again, that time is now. I'm Kaylee Fretz, and this is the first of 4 special episodes of the Cycling Tips podcast, brought to you in partnership with Rapha. We're calling them the Roadmap episodes. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to speak to team principals like Дейва Брейлсфорда, who you just heard. We're going to speak to professional riders and fans. We'll talk to the people pushing cycling forward, and others protecting what bike racing already has. The goal is to shed some light on the inner workings of this sport and hopefully present some solutions. So let's get started. With me today, and over the next 4 episodes, is Oliver Duggan, the author of Rapha's original roadmap document. How are you, Oliver?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oliver's going to be in all of the next 4 episodes. He's kind of our guide through this entire process. In this first episode, we'll introduce the initial research project that led to Rapha's partnership with EF, the development of an alternative calendar, and a different approach to team management and sponsorship. And we'll discuss how the entire structure of the sport could be altered by the 2020 season, or what's left of it. We unpick ongoing, behind-the-scenes discussions of a franchise model, horse trading over the calendar, the reality facing the most popular and successful teams, and what it means for the second half of the year and beyond. Let's start at the beginning, though. Ollie, let's begin with the roadmap.
Yeah, it was. It started back in 2016, 17, when Rapha was coming to the end of their connection with Team Sky, and we'll hear from Brailsford later and JV, the kind of 2 teams that bookend the research project. But it was initially led by Joe Harris and Steve Maxwell of the Outer Line, and Dan Van Reeth as a kind of internal research project into what are the opportunities, challenges facing the sport, and what could Rapha do to get back into the sport? The founding principle of the brand is to make cycling the most popular sport in the world, which whenever you say out loud is a little bit lofty, a little bit nerve-wracking, but that is absolutely the reason that most people come to work at the brand. And when they left Team Sky, it wasn't immediately clear what they could actually do to help grow the sport, to reach a bigger audience, to engage with more fans, to fulfill that mission. And so for the best part of 2 years, I and the 3 contributors worked on this research project, which was looking at every single aspect of pro cycling. So the calendar, how it got to be the way it was and how it could change, teams, how they got to be the way they were, how they could change, what impact it has on riders, fans, the way that the media is presented, the economics and governance of the sport. And we interviewed 50, 60 people who were involved in some element or another in like pretty major decisions that created the sport that we now have, and put together this piece of work, which some people found quite controversial. Most people didn't read or haven't heard of. But for Rapha became a really important document for guiding our way towards EF, towards the work that we do with Lachlan Morton and Alex Howes and Canyon Tram and the various steps that we've made on the pro side since then.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when this thing came out, it was certainly, well, it was massive. Unsurprisingly, you guys spent 2 or 3 years on it. And we sifted through it, the journalists at CyclingTips and I, and tried to sort of parse exactly what you guys could come up with. And a lot of the recommendations were progressive, strategic, I would say, but also sort of fundamentally at odds with a lot of the sort of history of the sport. Maybe not even at odds with the history, but at odds with the sort of the forces at play within the sport, right? I think I remember having a conversation on this very podcast, I think it was with Neil Rogers, about the power of the ASO and how that was going to be a difficult thing to overcome with any of the recommendations that you guys ended up making. As a result, that, until some of these barriers were overcome, a lot of these changes that we were talking about would be very difficult to actually execute. And I think that's why this particular time and why this particular series that we're making right now is actually very interesting, because a lot of the sort of assumptions around pro cycling have suddenly been thrown out the window. And I think that's why we were so interested in this particular project and in looking at what pro cycling is going to be in 2020 and what it could possibly be going forward, given the fact that we're not wiping the slate clean, because all these races and these teams and these things still exist, and the power players are still there, but it's certainly changed the way things feel. And as our listeners will hear over the course of the next 45 minutes or an hour, the folks that we've spoken to, Brailsford and Wouters, they're very much of the same opinion that this is going to have an impact on the sport going forward.
It's very rare that the conversation around the work ever is about what the recommendations are. It's always that it can never happen, or these too many forces at play that prevent it from happening. And I guess they're two different stages, right? The first stage is getting around the table and deciding, what do you want the sport to look like? And you kind of have to park and put a pin in, the ASO versus the UCI, the different team structures and the different amount of money that they have, the various pressures on having calendars, races all over the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to put a pin in all of that and say, what do we want the sport to look like? And one of the side effects of the circumstances now is that they're being forced to do that. And we see in the conversation with JV and Brailsford and Simon that everybody involved in the sport is kind of being forced to look at it and make a list and say, okay, what do we want it to be? If we can only have this, this, and this, what makes the cut?
That's a nice segue into the first section of this podcast, which is focused on the calendar. And this is, I think, the thing that we really focused on when the roadmap first came out. And it was the thing that I've pushed personally, and I know a lot of other journalists and reporters have pushed, is that the current calendar is just too bloated and too overloaded, and there's too many overlapping races, and it makes it really hard in a lot of ways to be a fan. And so we thought a good place to start here would be, is this an opportunity, a silver lining type opportunity, to slim down the pro cycling calendar? Maybe before we dive into that, what was the sort of end result? What were the recommendations that the roadmap came up with on this front?
Just as a side point, if I was structuring the work again, I wouldn't put the calendar at the start, because basically it's the only thing anybody ever talks about. You bury it right at the end and make them read through all the dross first. But the simple idea was, like, if you were starting from scratch and you had the crown jewels of cycling, the Grand Tours, the classics, the monuments, what could you do to create a calendar that made sense and better answered the question, who's the best cyclist in the world? Because the thing that, when we spoke to people from other sports and looked at the models of other sports, that was one of the major drivers for fandom, right? For increasing the number of fans, is being able to have that conversation down the pub. It's like, who's the best footballer, who's the best tennis player, and it helps that they compete against each other regularly. And so the recommended model was to break up the World Tour into two divisions. You have a first and a second division. In the first division, you have all your prestigious races. You have a one-day series and a Grand Tour series. And in the one-day series, they happen every weekend. There's a men's and a women's event. There's a mass participation sportive. tick off all the major classics and monuments, and you add races in the key markets, and you have like 10 one-day races over the course of 10 weeks. And all of your great classics riders compete in it. And then you have a separate Grand Tour series that spans the summer, where you have the 3 Grand Tours, and you rearrange them so you have the Giro that lasts 2 weeks, the Vuelta that lasts 2 weeks, and then the crown amongst the crowns, the Tour de France, that finishes the season off. And there's options to have like tune-up 1 week races in between, and a matching women's Grand Tour calendar. All of that is sacrilegious, and has basically just torn up 100 years of cycling history.
You should have seen the comment section when we talked about it. It was great.
I bet. But when you look at other sports, one of the more successful ones are the ones that have a very clear narrative over the course of a season. And we know in our sport there's very different rider styles and very different types of races, but they largely fall into, you know, your one-day heroes and your Grand Tour heroes. And the idea was to try and offer a model for a season that would make slightly more sense than the 200 or so race days we have now. And, you know, we spoke to Дейва Брейлсфорда this week, and even he was saying that the cycling calendar is being forced to make these prioritizations of which races are going to make the cut and which aren't. And he was surprisingly open about the possibility of quite a different looking calendar in 2020 and maybe even beyond.
One of the things it's made interesting to consider in this little period is if we've got 3 months of racing at the end of a year, then we can't have every race. So we've got to decide, okay, well, which ones are the priority races? And of course, when you prioritize something, the harsh reality is you're deprioritizing something else. I think the interesting thing through this process of having to do that is, in fact, it's crystallizing the thinking of what a lot of talk has been about, you know, it's been more of a, you know, maybe we could do this, maybe that, maybe if we had to choose, we'd do this, etc., etc. But actually, the reality is, although we're not maybe as black and white about it in terms of the stark reality, yes, we're doing this, no, we're doing that, we are actually making some priorities from races, and we are actually choosing. So we are, in effect, you know, in reality, we're going through that process. And I think it's very interesting to observe and listen carefully to what fans, teams and riders all want. Well, there's definite dialogue between the race organisers themselves, obviously, the teams as a group, and you got the AIGCP, which is the body, the team's representation, which is recognised by the UCI, and any other kind of representation isn't recognised by the UCI's formal representation. You've got the obviously the riders' union, and the riders and the riders themselves, and of course the UCI who are trying to oversee the whole thing. So there's discussion between the teams, the AIGCP and sort of Velon groupings, the organisers amongst themselves, and then the UCI who are trying to orchestrate, if you like, the whole thing to make sure that it fits. And of course, you know, if you change the slot of the Giro into the proposed slot that it's in now, then the races that were there previously, maybe races like, you know, I don't know, the Tour of Britain, or, you know, some of those kind of races that were fitted in that period, you know, they're going to get superseded by the Giro.
It's interesting to me that Brailsford is so, he doesn't feel particularly emotional about it, which I guess is not actually that surprising for Дейва Брейлсфорда. But it does kind of bring up a follow-up question here, which is, if you're going to take a big calendar and shrink it to a little calendar, whether that is the job of an individual or a particular entity, or whether this is just a question of attrition. And we hear from Jonathan Wautersa in just a moment, and he puts it in a very interesting way, which is this sort of balance between strategy and attrition in terms of, is anyone actually coming to this and picking the races that are actually the most important and actually tell the best story? Or is this just a matter of who can survive?
You've got to imagine that the UCI and the various representatives of the different regions are making those arguments. But it doesn't take a genius to work out that it's all about protecting the Tour. Like everything, all the momentum is behind, can we make the Tour happen? Can we save the Tour? And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw races fall like by the wayside. The further on you get, the more the Tour has to potentially move or push around. Then everything else is kind of just we wait and we find out what's going on with the tour, and then we fit in what we can.
Well, let's hear from Jonathan Wautersa on this. His main point is that there's nobody actually, no individual, no main entity making this decision, and that it is fundamentally, as you say, it's can we get the Tour de France into 2020, and then looking into 2021, which races still exist?
We're going to see attrition of a lot of races. We're going to see a lot of races not be able to figure out a way to go forward in 2021. There are plenty of races on the calendar that I would say that there was sort of a momentum to them, that they were being supported by their local town or whatever else. But like once you kind of skip 1 year, it's really hard to get going again. I mean, we've seen that in the US, where like Tour of Georgia, Tour of Missouri, that like you miss 1 year, and then they say, oh, we're postponing the race a year, but it's really difficult to get off the ground again, right? Again, not the way I would want to see this happen, but that attrition could really serve to be a positive thing. Right now, I would say the calendar, World Tour calendar, race calendar is completely overcrowded with events that essentially hurt each other's values. Like there's just too many events, so like none of them can actually create true value because there's so many of them. And by culling that back, or by having that cull happen, we could get to a point where the events that are still there are the ones that everyone is focusing on. We're not having so many overlaps, so many days where the team is racing in 3 or 4 places at the same time. We're focusing on one race because that's the race that made it through. And all the teams are focusing on that one race because that's the race that made it through. And when that happens, that's not only going to bring more value to the teams, it's going to bring more value to that race, because that will be the most important race on that weekend, period, for everyone in the world. And that's what makes this sport more understandable to a broader audience, and eventually brings in more fans, like more people interest, that it becomes more understandable, as opposed to having 3-4 races on the same day and no one actually understands which race is important and which one isn't.
This is a key point here. This is the crux of the argument that both Wouters and the roadmap are trying to make, which is that if the calendar is too full and too many races overlap, or even if they don't overlap, you just have a significant portion of the World Tour that doesn't really feel like the World Tour, that doesn't have TV coverage, that doesn't have much fan support, that is a real fundamental problem for the sport as a whole, because it sort of muddies the waters. It muddies the sport. It makes it more difficult to follow. Now, the opposing argument here is that this is a sport that's well over 100 years old. We have 100 years of history and nostalgia and great racing and fantastic athletes, and each one of these races, they all have that history and they all have that nostalgia to them. And if you are a diehard fan, it's still possible to follow the entire season. And you could even argue that with so many races, that's just more to consume. But Wouters here is arguing that that's romantic thinking, not strategic thinking. And that right now, of all times, strategic thinking is what we actually need.
If you want to get down to a real strategic perspective,
I do.
Okay. So like the way I would, if I were just going to start from scratch, which I don't think that's what's going to happen here, because it's not like this is going to be a survival perspective, not a strategic perspective. But if you were taking it to a strategic perspective, I mean, it would be really simple. It would be that you would, on any given week or any given weekend, the World Tour would have one event that everyone was focusing on. So as to say, Paris-Nice and Tirreno-Adriatico don't overlap each other. Either one of them survives and the other one doesn't, or they both go to a 3-day or 4-day format. So what that does is that every team, a World Tour team, let's say we started Tour Down Under and then we moved to, the next event, and it is that we're focusing on one race at a time, and that each weekend or each week, whether it's a stage race or is the battle between the best teams who are sending their best riders for that event, week in, week out. There is never a moment where clearly the roster of the race and the rosters of the teams are compromised by the fact that they're having to dilute themselves out. So my calendar just looks, it's probably realistically a 40% reduction in the number of days in the World Tour. What it looks like is that you're covering as much geographic area as you can, that you're covering different continents, Asia, Australia, North America, South America, and obviously Western Europe, Eastern Europe, that you're covering as many potential, and Africa, as covering as many potential marketplaces as you can, and that it's running on a single line. And obviously, I would say, priority be given to the races that the fans are most passionate about, i.e., the monuments, the monuments, the Grand Tours, the races that, the races that truly draw a core level of passion and affection, and then you build that outwards, and you stop diluting over the top of the races that are actually really meaningful to the riders and the fans.
I think one of the interesting things when you speak with Jonathan Wautersa on this particular topic, and actually on a lot of different topics, is he feels somewhat resigned to his fate. And maybe it is because he's been through quite a lot, his team has been through quite a lot, and he's tried a number of different ways to force progress and hasn't really seen a lot of success outside of his own team. You guys, EF, Rapha, your adventure calendar, your alternative calendar, I should say, that's a small example of the kind of progress that he's been pushing for. But at the end of the day, it's not sport wide. It's not all of road cycling. There aren't other. You're not facing down Quick Step at Dirty Kansas.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's interesting to talk to Jonathan Wautersa about this sort of thing because, like I said, he sounds relatively resigned to the fact that there is not enough strategy happening. There's not enough strategic thinking happening. And instead, it comes down to, can we save the Tour de France? And then who else survives and who else can make it through not just 2020, which I think 2020 is going to be a very strange year and a one-off, hopefully. But into 2021, what does the 2021 calendar look like if 25% of the races die, or if 40% of the races die? It's not going to be a matter of let's figure out this new schedule and make sure it works and make sure it has a nice narrative. It's going to be a matter of, okay, Paris-Nice and Tirreno currently overlap. It's not a matter of strategically figuring out how to make those two work together. It's, does one of them still exist and the other one doesn't, right? And it's sort of solving the problem through attrition.
The complexity of why each of those races might survive or not is unfathomable. Like each one of these countries where these races are held will have their own restrictions on how many people can go and watch sporting events, how far sporting events, how much land they can cover, like what the media restrictions might be about getting groups of people together to create TV broadcasts or content. And so all of these ways that these races make revenue that continue their survival are hugely in doubt, and probably will be for the next 3, 4, 5 months. Mass participation looks like it's going to be the last thing to come back, and so we might not know until we're deep into 2020, maybe even 2021, what the 2021 calendar could look like. You'll probably start to see races dropping like flies over the next 6 months or so.
I think that the reality is that, and we've discussed this on this podcast numerous times, but the gorilla in the room here is the ASO, and they own the Tour de France, and the Tour de France essentially helps fund lots of other races across the calendar. And if you're looking at the calendar for 2021, you have to think that ASO owned races are probably among the safest, right? And so we may end up sort of accidentally with the sort of strategy that Jonathan Wautersa is talking about, because if non-ASO races struggle to exist and we end up with a primarily ASO calendar, there's your strategy, right?
Exactly. One of the side effects of any recession is that inequality grows, right? So the big players get bigger and the small ones get further away. And so for the likes of the ASO, for teams like Ineos, these kind of circumstances create huge opportunities. And a note on JV's resignation. It's funny, like in the roadmap research, we spoke to loads of different team owners and people that have been around the block a few times, and it's this weird mix of like huge respect and love and admiration for the sport and eagerness to see it grow, and yet this kind of underlying exhaustion with not knowing how you make it happen. Like, who do you get around the table? And it's this like smoke and mirrors horse trading that goes on in the background that a few people hold the keys to, and it feels like if you got those people in a room now, you'd probably get a very different outcome to the one that you had 12 months ago.
Let's chat about this from a fan's perspective. And for this, we brought in your big boss, Sаймon Моттрама, founder of Rapha, who is, clearly involved in a lot of these things and deeply tied to a team like EF now, but essentially comes at this from a historical perspective and a fan perspective.
I like this. I like the suggestion that he's coming from a historical perspective. I like that. Yeah, I think you probably wouldn't found a brand like Rapha if you didn't have a huge love of the sport and all the various romantic stories that it contains. And so he's always been a fan, more than maybe anything else. And he still watches almost every day of World Tour racing and cyclocross racing and every other bit of racing that he can get his hands on. But having said all that, was backing of these really radical suggestions in the roadmap. And I think his argument is, and you'll hear from him, is that he doesn't want the sport to kind of die off in the hands of these, I guess, anoraks that want to keep it this hidden thing that only certain people understand, and it's like this hobby that they get to hold on to and pass on to their people around them, and that ultimately is one of the surefire ways of making sure it doesn't grow. And he'd much rather blow it open and take it away from the likes of him and his friends who can get around and reminisce about the 1967 whatever.
I think there's a good argument to be had between whether you need to make the sport more financially restructured, more financially stable, or whether actually you need to make it more exciting and more interesting. And as a fan, I would always go for the latter. And right at the heart of that, I would say, is probably having a shorter, more understandable, more exciting calendar. That's the number one thing as a fan I would love to see come out of it. Not because I don't love the 400 odd races that I watch every year, because I watch all of them and I'll scour the internet for anything that I can watch that's racing. But I'm a bit of a nutcase, I'm a bit obsessed, and I don't see many of the more casual fans and more regular cyclists who just don't watch racing. I don't see them engaging with 3/4 of the races that happen, partly because they can't, because there's too much, partly because some of them are just frankly not very interesting. And there's no sense of narrative and no sense of progression through the season, and there's just too much racing. So I think that would be my number one thing: is shorten the calendar, make it more interesting, create a narrative, and make the pie bigger for everybody.
To play devil's advocate, I've got the voices of various kind of more traditional figures ringing in my head, who say that the complexity is what creates the nuance and the romance, and the fact that you're quote unquote grandfathered into the sport is one of the things that create these lifelong connections with it. And if it went to a more American style weekly calendar or something that was so rigid as to have a easy to follow structure, you'd lose some of that. Does that hold any truck with you?
No, I think it's bollocks. Sorry to be crude, but it's what always happens. I mean, and I am the most traditional of traditionalists in many ways, and I love those races. God, I love those. Those funny Italian races I was talking about that happen around Bologna and in northern Italy after the World. I just think they're an incredible race. I love that. But it depends on your ambition, doesn't it? And I don't want cycling to be a niche sport for a few people. I just think that's selling it short. So everybody that I see that takes it up, my friends who I've introduced to the sport, people that in my family, people that I see starting riding, they go on this incredible journey, and when they start getting into racing, there's so much to go for. Don't we want millions more people to experience that, or are we happy to keep it as this arcane, unprofitable, tiny sport that matters nothing to most people, and it just matters a huge amount to us. I just think I'm way more ambitious than that, and it makes me really angry that people will try and kill it for future generations by doing this. There's no reason why the sport has to exist. It might get wiped away by other sports who've got their act together. And there's only so much attention in the world's population for sports. Cycling doesn't have a right to get that. And I think we've got so much more to offer than any other sport, so we should be more ambitious.
Well, I agree. Bollocks to the traditionalists. I think I particularly like hearing Simon say that because, I don't know. Well, we were talking about this before we threw to him. He's a bit of a traditionalist. Like he's a nostalgic guy. He loves the history of the sport and where it came from and why all that matters. And it makes what he says next particularly interesting too. Suddenly we're staring down the barrel at trying to compress an entire season into just a couple months, and that is forcing the kind of decision-making that Simon is talking about here.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you look at all the races trying to be compressed into that 5-6 month period, or even less, and it almost reflects the problem we're in. And there's no sense of order in which these things should take place. There's a priority list in terms of revenue and impact, I'm sure. But actually, you should be able to sit there and go, well, of course, we need to start the season here and finish it here. And even though it's shorter, we'll take some things out and we'll still have that structure. There's no sense of it at all, which I think is really, it's interesting and slightly worrying, but also quite exciting. I mean, for me, the ones that have to sit in there that I would prioritize over everything else, of course, the Tour needs to be there. Without the Tour, and it's not a financial thing, it's more an impact to the sport overall and to the rest of the population. People don't know about many races in cycling, and if they're not a cyclist, the one thing they absolutely will know is the Tour. And I'd have the Tour and the monuments, and the Giro would probably be my first selection. They'd be the ones I'd pull out the bag first and make sure they fit. But then what order should they go in? Should it finish with the Tour because the Tour's the best race, or the biggest race? Or should it be 2 classic seasons with Grand Tours in the middle, all in a 5-month window? It just needs some thought and it needs some logic to it.
I think the next piece of this puzzle is the teams themselves. So if the calendar is being slimmed down through attrition or strategy, more likely attrition, the teams are going through a similar process, right? And it's worth discussing who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers on this front.
Yeah, so it's really interesting hearing from JV and Brailsford, the heads of 2 very, very different teams, and various other team owners who are either struggling or not. And it seems that the unifying factor is what the sponsorship model that they're in is. So if you're a holiday business, or you're a business that is restricted from doing what you do by this circumstance, then your marketing budget is the thing that comes under scrutiny. And if you have a multi-million dollar cycling team, then that's going to be one of the things that's going to get looked at really closely. And so if it's obvious that some teams are going to be more at risk than others, and JV says conservatively it might be 3. Other people say it could be as many as 10, depending on whether or not the Tour goes ahead. And so there are definitely going to be some really big winners and some big losers. And, we asked Brailsford, probably the biggest, most well-resourced team in the sport, what he thought the outcome was going to be.
So on the one hand, you want to see the best and sort of keep the crown jewels of the sport, as it were, in this little window. On the other hand, you don't want to separate and detach yourself away from the rest of the sport And an element, an elite part of the sport moves away and drifts away, and the rest of the sport is kind of left behind, really, really struggling, and faces quite dire consequences through that. So I think but they're the harsh realities of life.
If we continue to step further down the line from teams, so as Brailsford said, small teams gonna feel the pinch. Teams with very particular sponsors gonna feel the pinch. Some of the major teams, some of the teams funded by just wealthy individuals. I'm thinking Ineos and Israel Startup Nation and teams like that. Sylvan Adams can fund this team into perpetuity and not see his net worth drop by any significant margin. So why would he not continue to do that? But the next step here is to talk about the riders and the effect on them. Basically, what happens to the rider market if teams start to disappear, if big teams start to disappear. And Jonathan Wautersa speaks to this with clarity and the understanding that comes from somebody who has dealt with signing contracts and dealing with the rider market for quite some time.
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, obviously, I don't think that there's a single professional cyclist in the world that is overcompensated. I mean, seriously, these guys, their job, it's the hardest job in the world. Like, it's unbelievably difficult. The pressures are unbelievably high. The dedication, the level of sacrifice they have to make is so incredibly high. And, they're compensated at a fraction of what the other professional sports make. And it's not to say, I mean, don't get me wrong, when you read about 3 and 4 million euro contract, it's a huge level of compensation, right? But the risks that they put through, the sacrifices that they've made, and the fact that, the average career of a professional cyclist is 6 years. We know about a lot of guys that have a 10-year or 15-year career, but the average is 6 years. So you're looking at people who have foregone going to university, have foregone all kinds of other job opportunities, social opportunities, have really dedicated their entire life to the exclusion of everything else to get 6 years. So it's like, okay, you better be able to make enough money to retire in 6 years or else, you're not in a good place. So anyway, just that caveat that there's not a single professional cyclist out there that is overcompensated. So it doesn't take much for the rider market to severely pull back. Meaning it's not that you don't need 50% of the teams to go away for the rider salaries to go down by 50%. That's not the way this market will work. This is a little bit more like the oil market that we've just seen. What happens if there are, let's say 3 teams are no longer operational next year. So you go from 19 to 16. That's going to leave 90 riders, plus or minus a bit, on the open marketplace. The remaining 16 teams cannot absorb 90 riders. Now, those riders can get absorbed into pro continental teams that maybe will try to move up into the World Tour, or maybe the pro continental teams also have their own sort of attrition going on. But to make the analogy easy, or to make the story easy, easier to understand, if you have 90 riders that are going into 90 riders going into a pool of less than 600 total World Tour riders, you're looking at a huge percentage just basically being pushed into the marketplace that aren't going to be able to be absorbed. So what that'll do to pricing is at the very high end, your top 5% of athletes, those prices will not change. The best of the best will remain high. And your basic entry-level neo-pros, guys just coming in, those prices will essentially remain unchanged. But your mid to sort of medium-high level riders, that market will be crushed. I mean, that will, having 20% surplus workforce will probably pull back the salaries, anywhere up to 50%.
So that middle of the market is in that. Just to put some numbers on it, are we talking in the sort of like $250,000 a year, $500,000 a year kind of range?
Yeah, that's right. That's the magnitude. Yeah, roughly. Mm-hmm.
I think there is a lot to unpack there, and it frankly doesn't sound good. If I was a professional cyclist and I heard what JV just said, I would be, well, particularly if I was one of those middle of the rung type of riders, the ones making 250 grand, 500K, which is sort of the middle of the rider salary market at this point. I'd be pretty concerned. I mean, JV was talking about massive drops like that, even if only a couple teams disappear. And that's a real problem for a whole lot of riders out there.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most candid we've heard a team principal be on that issue, because we've heard rumors and we've seen confirmation that some riders are having temporary drops in salaries, and there being huge amounts of the staff of the teams are being furloughed, and all the various things that you would expect any business to be doing to weather the storm. But the idea that it could have as much as a 50% hit on the majority of the peloton for those teams that aren't as don't have as deeper pockets as others is huge. Like, that could have a massive impact on not just the way that the 2021 season happens, but the entire development structure of riders in the sport.
So I'm glad that we talked to two very different team principals here. We've got Jonathan Vaughter's, who, though his team now, EF, is prior to this pandemic was financially secure and somewhere sort of budget-wise kind of in the middle of the World Tour. But he's been very much near the bottom of the World Tour before. And then we also talked with Дейва Брейлсфорда, who has by far the richest team in the entire sport. And I'm going to play a quick clip here from Vaughters talking about how he hopes that this COVID situation might help level out budgets. And then we're going to hear from Brailsford on something else entirely.
Without a doubt, we will lose a few teams. And without a doubt, there will be leaning out of many others. In a lot of ways, I would say, and this is certainly not the way that I would have wanted to go about this, but I'll still say that's a good thing. Basically, the World Tour, starting in about 2008, 2009, sort of with the entrance of Sky as sort of like the first precipitating factor to this, the budgets of teams as a whole have sort of outstripped, inflation by about 50x. And unfortunately, the entrance of a lot of like high net worth individuals and entities, that this is more of like a vanity project as opposed to a true marketing tool. Because of the entrance of that sort of entity, we've seen an inflation of those team budgets that is no longer commensurate with the marketing value of the teams. And so my hope is that maybe this will cause a readjustment to what is a more sustainable scenario, meaning that the cost of the teams is matching up with the value that they provide, from a marketing perspective. And I think we just got maybe a little bit like out of kilter with that, again, because of these like high net worth, like vanity projects that have inflated the market. And so if that happens, if we get to a place where things are in a little bit more sustainable budget point, then I can only see that as being positive for the World Tour.
Now, I'm not sure that Jonathan Vaughter's is actually right about that. I think he's hopeful that this could help to balance the budgets and pull some of the big teams down and sort of level the playing field, which is something that he's talked about a number of times. I think maybe a more realistic view of 2021 and beyond, though, is an even greater inequality within the World Tour. Ollie, you asked Дейва Брейлсфорда about this very thing, and you asked him point blank whether he was going to go on a shopping spree.
For the teams that are, more stable than others, like you guys, it must be tempting to look around and think you could probably pick up a bunch of riders. You could maybe pick up a women's team. Like, it's good. It's probably the most affordable any of those assets will ever be, given the instability of everything else. Is that something that you guys are thinking about or considering?
Well, we're certainly looking. I think we'd be lying if we didn't think otherwise, because I think everybody, when there's a lot of instability and things are changing, people look at what do they need to do and what are the opportunities and what's going to change. And, it's not just, I don't think it's just the smaller teams or teams that are being impacted. It's also lots of the technical partners, so clothing manufacturers or, I don't know, we got all the sort of bike manufacturers, nutrition, tires, wheels, everybody who's supplying in, who's dependent on retail at this moment in time is going to have a pretty tough time of it, in the main. So I think it makes you stop and think through a lot of different opportunities and parameters and what could happen. And so we're very much keeping an eye on all of that and trying to think that one through. And if there are opportunities to change or act in that sense in a positive way, then we'd certainly consider it.
So what do we think? What's this going to do to team budgets as a whole? Are we going to see a leveling, or are we going to see an increase in disparity? Are we going to see an F1 style, there are only 2 teams in the world that can win any of the big races?
Yeah, I think each of these teams are going to operate in whatever landscape they find themselves in. So if you're incentivized to win the Tour because the Tour is the biggest thing for your sponsor to get marketing at, and it's one of a handful of races that's left and still mega important, then you're going to do everything you can to win the Tour de France. And I guess it goes back to that earlier point of whether these changes are strategic or by attrition. And they're almost certainly going to be by attrition. And so I think that it's unlikely that you're going to see the bigger teams voluntarily reduce their budgets if they have it available to them. They're going to continue to want to win as many races as they can, and offering big rider salaries in a market when no one else can is a pretty good way of getting a team that's going to get you those wins.
And Ineos was able to do that even prior to this, really. I mean, they've been essentially able to pick up almost any talent that they've wanted to for the last couple of years. And that I see is only increasing. And yeah, you can't blame Dave Brailsford for that. You can't blame Ineos for that. If they've got the cash, that's the sport.
And I think it's why not only is this potentially a pretty significant opportunity for changing the sport, it's a hugely urgent one as well. Because if you did get the right people around the table and you were able to have more strategic than attritional reform and change, then you could definitely get to the vision that JV is talking about and the one that was outlined in the roadmap. Of course you could. Like, more extreme changes have happened in the world of sport in the last 50 years. But if you don't, and it all happens by attrition, then you could potentially have a even more unequal, complicated, kind of bizarre sport in 2021 and beyond.
It's important to end on a slightly positive note.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this stuff is depressing or uncertain, and I think it's important to remember that it comes from such a good place. Like, there's so many people that love the sport, that want to see it survive, and not just survive, grow. And when was the last time you heard JV and Dave Brailsford, two such different team principals, talking openly about what the future of cycling was, and actually thinking about, could the calendar change? Could the team structure change? How will riders navigate this? And that is, I think, relentlessly positive. And it's an uncertain time, but over the course of this series, we're going to hear from so many people that care so deeply about the sport that's a great thing.
The basis of this series of podcasts here is that in chaos comes opportunity. And we feel like now is the time to be talking about these things and to be thinking about these things. And if we can do our small part, CyclingTips and Rapha, if we can do our small part in pushing some of these things forward and coming up with concepts and ideas and talking with the right people and getting those people's thoughts and opinions out to the world, then great. That's exactly what we want to do with these. With that, we must wrap up for today. And we'll be back next week with another Roadmap episode.